New York City, 1915, the beating heart of America. A city overflowing with life and with death. Ships docked at the harbor each dawn, spilling wave after wave of new souls onto its crowded shores. Men, women, and children clutching cracked leather suitcases, their eyes wide with the desperate hope that this city of iron and smoke would grant them a future. But the future in New York was never guaranteed. Beneath the shimmering skyline, in the dark veins of its alleys and tenements, thousands gasped for air inside rooms too small for breathing. Coal soot coated the walls, rats scurried between thin blankets. Families slept stacked in layers like coffins, 6 or 7 to a single room. In such places, death was not a visitor. Death was a resident, constant, ordinary, expected. Typhus, tuberculosis, influenza. They came like the tide. For every christening sung in a church, a funeral bell rang the next week. Children grew up knowing the sight of a black-draped carriage rattling down their street. Mothers sat stiff in photographs beside the bodies of their lifeless infants, their faces solemn, their arms wrapped tightly as though clutching time itself. Death was everywhere, and it was normalized. And in those moments, when the breath left a body and grief settled over a household like heavy ash, there was one figure the community turned to: the Undertaker. To the families of New York, he was not simply a businessman. He was a priest of silence, a custodian of dignity, a trusted guide through the most fragile threshold of all. When a child died, it was he who carried the body. When a husband collapsed at his workbench, it was he who laid him out. He promised that, if life was cruel, death would at least be reverent. But what if that promise was a lie? What if, in the very hour you were most vulnerable, the figure you trusted most, the man who took your wife, your brother, your child into his care, was not a guardian of dignity, but a predator? What if his hunger went beyond profit from coffins and embalming fees? What if his appetite was darker, unspeakable, a craving too profane to imagine? This is the story of one of the most disturbing scandals ever whispered through New York's funeral trade. A scandal so grotesque, so vile, that for decades it was smothered beneath shame. It is the story of a man who carried the title Undertaker, but who practiced something so monstrous it left scars on the conscience of a city. At first, there were only rumors, and in New York, rumors were everywhere. A grieving mother whispered that her daughter's body looked oddly disturbed when she viewed her before burial. A young assistant, tasked with sweeping floors, noticed his employer lingered too long in the embalming room after midnight, the lamp still glowing when all others were dark. A police officer, drunk in a Bowery tavern, mentioned hearing strange talk about the man with the funeral parlor. His companions laughed, dismissing it as obscene exaggeration, but rumors, when they survive ridicule, grow teeth. One whisper becomes 3, 3 becomes 6. Soon the pattern is too sharp to ignore. A worker abruptly quit and refused to say why. A mourner quietly confessed that the coffin lid was nailed shut before she was allowed to say her final goodbye. A parish priest, shaken and pale, admitted that one corpse seemed oddly disheveled, as though disturbed after preparation. Each detail was fragile. Alone, each could be explained away, but together they formed a picture that no one wanted to see. Because to accuse an undertaker in 1915 was to accuse a sacred figure. These men were guardians of the dead, keepers of a ritual older than the city itself. To suggest that one of them could exploit the bodies in his care was not only scandalous, it was blasphemy. And yet, the whispers did not stop. They spread through churches, into kitchens, across fences and alleys. At first, spoken only in hushed tones. Then, in sharper voices, even those who had once scoffed began to falter, unease gnawing at the edges of their certainty. Because once the seed of suspicion is planted, it grows like ivy. And soon, the question lingered in every mind like a splinter. What if it was true? And then, the truth clawed its way into the light. The fragments became evidence. The whispers became testimony, and what they revealed was not clumsiness, nor error, nor chance. It was an obsession, ritual, a hunger so revolting it could not be mistaken for anything but deliberate violation. What happened inside that funeral home in 1915 was not simply a crime. It was desecrated. It was betrayal. Families sent their dead into the Undertaker's hands believing they would be treated with reverence. Instead, they were subjected to acts too profane to speak aloud, and yet we must speak, because silence is what allowed it to happen. Silence nearly buried the truth forever, but history has a way of clawing through soil. Secrets rot, but they do not disappear. And so tonight, we will walk those dimly lit halls once again. We will pry open coffins never meant to be disturbed. We will sift through yellowed newspapers, police transcripts, and whispers that never fully died. And together, we will face a crime so grotesque that more than a century later, its very mention curdles the blood. This is the case of the necrophiliac Undertaker, and once you hear it, you will never look at death, or those entrusted with it, the same way again. Welcome back to Truth Uncaged, the place where shadows are not ignored, where silence is broken, and where history's darkest corners are dragged back into the light. If you've been here before, you already know. This is not a channel for comfort. This is not a place for bedtime stories. Here, we deal in the truths that gnaw at the edges of sanity. Truths that demand you look closer, even when every instinct tells you to look away. Tonight, what we are about to unravel may be the most disturbing descent we've taken together. Not a crime of greed, not even of rage, but a betrayal so profound it tears at the fabric of trust itself. The bond between the grieving and the ones sworn to safeguard their dead. This story is not only about death, it is about the desecration of death, about what happens when reverence becomes ritual, and ritual becomes something far more profane. Before we open that door and step into the Undertaker's parlor, I want to ask you something. What do you believe drives a man to cross this line? Is it the madness of a fractured mind? Is it an unholy obsession, festering unseen beneath a calm exterior? Or could it be something more deliberate? The quiet intoxication of power over those who cannot resist, those who cannot even scream. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share them, because tonight's case forces us to confront the question directly. What kind of darkness hides behind a face society calls respectable? And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed. Because here, we will not look away. We will not soften the edges. We will follow the truth, even when it leads us into places most would rather seal shut forever. What follows is not just a story. It is a descent, step by step, into a crime that history itself tried to bury. A crime that whispers even now, more than a century later. The first step begins. Now, New York, 1915, a city alive and a city rotting. On its surface, it glittered like the crown of a modern empire. Electric lamps blazed where only a generation earlier, horse-drawn wagons stumbled through shadows. Elevated trains thundered overhead, trolleys spat sparks across the cobblestones, and motorcars cut through streets that still reeked of manure. Skyscrapers clawed at the clouds, their steel bones and stone faces declaring to the world, progress had arrived. But progress was only half the story. Beneath the towers, poverty festered. In the Lower East Side, whole families suffocated together in single rooms, gaslight dimming against cracked plaster, rats scurrying across damp floorboards. A single cough could sweep through a household like fire, and a single fever could snuff out a child before dawn. These were not rare tragedies. They were the rhythm of the city itself. Death was everywhere. It lurked in the factories, where machines chewed through flesh and bone as indifferently as they produced goods. It prowled the construction sites, where men fell from scaffolds or were swallowed alive by collapsing walls. It waited at river crossings, where ferries tipped and bridges failed. And in the tenements, disease was its most faithful companion. Typhus, diphtheria, influenza, each moving like a shadow from bed to bed. In New York, the living walked shoulder to shoulder with mortality, and every toll of a church bell was both familiar and feared. And when death came, one man was always summoned, the Undertaker. Always summoned, the Undertaker. His arrival was a ritual, a knock at the door, the solemn black carriage waiting outside, the figure in the dark coat who ushered the household across the threshold from life into burial. He was more than a tradesman. He was part priest, part custodian, part magician of grief. He promised transformation, to take the collapsed body and return it dressed, composed, resting as though in peace. For the poor, it was the only dignity their dead would ever know. For the wealthy, it was a performance of propriety. Either way, the Undertaker's presence was sacred, but sacredness is often a mask. Behind those heavy doors, where families never followed, the air was thick with chemicals, formaldehyde, carbolic acid, the pungent tang of decay. Embalming had become the American way of death, imported from the battlefields of the Civil War. The work was technical, invasive, and secret. Few dared to ask what it required. Fewer still wished to see it done. Once a body passed into the Undertaker's hands, it belonged to him. His craft was cloaked in silence, and silence was part of the bargain. But silence is also a shield, and shields can hide monsters. By 1915, whispers began to stir. They began small, the sort of murmurs families share in low voices after the funeral carriage has gone. A widow muttered that her husband's hair had been strangely arranged, slicked in a way she never knew him to wear. A mother whispered that her child's body bore faint bruises no illness could explain. An apprentice confessed to seeing his employer linger too long beside the dead, his eyes unfocused, his hands hovering in a way that chilled the boy's blood. He left the trade soon after, unwilling to return to that room. Respectable society dismissed it all. To accuse an undertaker was unthinkable. It was to accuse not just a man, but the very foundation of dignity in death. Better to smother unease than to imagine the unimaginable. And so the whispers were pushed aside, buried, but whispers do not die. They multiply. Each rumor fed the next, and though the city was deafened by the constant toll of death, unease crept through cracks in the silence, because everyone knew the truth beneath their denial. Once the body entered that embalming room, it was beyond the reach of family, beyond the reach of prayer, beyond the reach of protection. It belonged wholly to the man in the black coat. And what if that man saw more than duty in the stillness of the dead? What if, behind his locked doors and chemical stench, he found something else, something forbidden? In the helpless silence of the corpses entrusted to him, the families wanted to believe otherwise. They needed to believe otherwise. But unease has weight, and weight has a way of breaking through. By 1915, that weight was pressing down hard. The city was drowning in death. The Undertaker's power was absolute. And behind the embalming room door, unchecked and unseen, one man's hunger began to thrive. The stage was set. A city addicted to progress, yet drowning in corpses, a profession guarded by secrecy, and a man with both access and impunity. It was the perfect breeding ground for the unthinkable. And soon, whispers would not be enough. Soon, there would be evidence. Evidence that forced New York to confront the most horrifying betrayal imaginable, that the guardian of dignity and death may also be its destroyer. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Funerals came and went the way they always had. Coffins lowered into the soil, priests whispering final prayers, families clutching one another as the earth swallowed what was once flesh and voice. The Undertaker bowed his head, the carriages rolled on, and the living stumbled back to their tenements, carrying sorrow in silence. Grief was a wound, but ritual made it bearable. That was how it had always been. That was how it was supposed to be. But in 1915, the surface began to ripple, tiny fractures. Little things are almost too small to notice, and yet, once seen, impossible to forget. A widow whispered that her husband looked wrong. The clothes didn't fit. His jacket swallowed his frame, his hair combed into a strange part she swore he never wore in life. Another mother swore her son's hands bore odd indentations, faint but deliberate, as if they'd been gripped too tightly. A daughter noticed faint bruising circling her father's throat. The Undertaker had explanations for all of it. Embalming leaves stains, fluids shift, skin discolors, memories blur in grief. Hair behaves differently once washed and oiled. Mourning distorts perception. The families nodded, ashamed of their doubts, because to question him was to question the sanctity of death itself. For a time they believed. But then came the first real crack. It came not from a grieving family, but from a boy, barely 16, too young to understand the shadows of the trade he'd stumbled into. His job was simple: sweep floors, carry water, fetch tools. He was not meant to ask questions. Not meant to see too much, but youth notices what it isn't supposed to. Youth listens, and youth, when pressed too far, speaks. He told his mother little things at first, that he dreaded the night shifts, that the undertaker worked late into the hours when the lamps guttered low and the street outside lay dead silent, and that sometimes, when he passed the closed door of the embalming room, he heard sounds, not the hiss of escaping gas, not the creak of settling boards, not the grotesque sigh a corpse sometimes makes as air escapes its lungs. No, these were different. Whispers, low, measured, deliberate. Too soft to make out the words, but too precise to dismiss. Once he swore he heard laughter, another time humming, a tuneless melody, part lullaby, part hymn, not sung to the living but crooned into the company of the dead. His mother told him it was imagination. Shadows and silence are cruel things, she said, but soon she could not dismiss what clung to him. His clothes stained with something dark and sticky, his skin carrying a stench no soap could erase, metallic, sweet, heavier than the sting of formaldehyde. And then, the ribbon. One morning she found it tucked into his coat pocket, pale, frayed at the edge. She knew it instantly. Just days earlier, she had watched it tied into the hair of a girl, a child from their parish, before the coffin lid was closed. That ribbon should have been sealed in the ground forever, and yet here it was, dangling from her son's pocket like a keepsake stolen from the grave. Her blood ran cold. She demanded an answer. The boy swore he hadn't taken it, sobbing, trembling, insisting he didn't know how it got there. But his mother knew. She knew what it meant, even if she dared not say the words aloud. Something unspeakable was happening behind that door, and the whispers spread, quiet at first, tucked into corners of churches, muttered across kitchen tables, shared in parlors with curtains pulled tight. No one wanted to believe it. To accuse an undertaker of such things was to accuse the entire ritual of death itself. It was blasphemy, but unease has a way of sharpening. It grows teeth, and when the first family made their discovery, it no longer looked like gossip. It looked like proof. Their daughter had been buried only days before, but heavy rains flooded the cemetery, forcing coffins to be unearthed and relocated. When the lid of her coffin was pried open, the sight inside froze every witness. This was not an embalming stain. This was not clumsy preparation. It was desecrated. And once that coffin was opened, the door to suspicion could never be closed again. It began with a single coffin. The funeral should have been simple, routine. A young woman, barely past girlhood, taken by illness too early. Her family gathered in grief, guided by ritual, trusting that the undertaker had done what he always promised, prepared their daughter with dignity, ready to be laid to rest. The coffin was sealed, polished, adorned with flowers. The undertaker reassured them everything was in order, but the mother hesitated. She needed her to see her daughter one last time, to kiss her forehead before the earth swallowed her forever. At first, the undertaker resisted. His voice, calm and measured, explained that embalming sometimes altered the features, that it was better to remember her as she had been. But the mother insisted. Grief is stubborn. Grief demands. Reluctantly, the lid was pried open, and what the family saw inside would ripple through the city like a curse. The girl's dress was torn, not gently frayed, but ripped as if in struggle. Her hair, once carefully braided, lay tangled and pinned in a crude, hurried fashion no mourner would allow. Along her arms were deep marks, violent, unmistakable. Not the decay of illness, not the scars of an accident, but the evidence of something done to her after death. The mother collapsed, screaming. Others rushed forward, only for their own grief to curdle into horror. The undertaker's excuses came swiftly. Too swiftly. Damage from embalming, he said. Mishandling during transport. Perhaps even the strain of disease. But his words clattered uselessly against the silence of the room. A silence broken only by the priest who had been standing nearby. His face pale, his lips pressed tight, he said nothing. But his eyes told the truth. The family did not forget, and they did not stay silent. Within days, whispers sharpened into accusations. Other families stepped forward, speaking of the strange details they had buried in their own hearts. rings missing from fingers, dresses soiled or disordered, haircut short, tied differently, sometimes crudely pinned as though in haste. A son's body was found with unexplained bruises. A husband's jaw left crooked, as if wrenched out of place. For every claim, the Undertaker had answers. Memory is fragile, he said. Grief clouds the mind. Details blur. And embalming. Embalming explains everything. But then came the stains. Assistants began to murmur. The ones who had lasted long enough to notice, and who now found themselves sick with unease. They spoke of strange hours, long after midnight, when their employer sent them home but stayed behind. They spoke of doors locked tight, of muffled noises behind them, of a man emerging hours later with trembling hands and clothes soiled in ways that no embalming fluid could explain. Some left the trade altogether, unable to name what they suspected, but unable to remain. And still no one wanted to believe. Finally, under mounting pressure, the authorities were summoned. The sheriff, skeptical and weary of gossip, agreed to investigate. He expected nothing more than the petty illusions of grief, sorrow twisting into superstition. But from the moment he stepped into that funeral home, something in the air unsettled him. The smell was wrong. Too thick, too heavy. Not merely the chemical sting of formaldehyde, but something metallic, cloying, like iron and rot entwined. In the embalming room, the sheriff's eyes lingered. Tools lay scattered, not with the neatness of precision, but with the disarray of frantic use. Jars uncapped, clothes discarded. On the wooden table itself were stains, soaked deep, darker than embalming fluid, darker than he dared to name. The Undertaker spoke with practiced calm, but his hands trembled. The sheriff said little. He ordered quiet surveillance, a close watch. He needed proof before the accusation could be made. And then proof arrived. One night, long after the city had gone quiet, the sheriff's men kept their vigil outside the funeral home. The lamps inside glowed late. The Undertaker had once again locked himself in, and from the shadows the deputies waited. When they forced their way inside, what they witnessed was not grief. It was not an accident. It was not madness. It was desecrated. It was an obsession. It was something so profane it could not be mistaken for anything but what it was. And with that discovery, the whispers ended. In their place rose something far heavier: accusation. For weeks, the sheriff's men kept their watch. It was a strange duty, and none of them cared for it. They weren't hunting an outlaw through the forests of upstate New York or breaking up drunken brawls on Bowery Street. No, this was different. This was silence, patience, and shadow. 2 men at a time, always in pairs, rotated to stand sentry across from the Undertaker's parlor. At first, it seemed like wasted effort. The Undertaker walked the streets in daylight with calm precision. He visited the butcher, nodded to the priest, even tipped his hat to children who dared meet his eye. His steps were measured, his voice polite. To any observer, he was respectability embodied, the very kind of man families would entrust with their dead. But the deputies began to notice a pattern. Every night, when the last mourner had left, a single lamp flickered to life in the embalming room. It stayed lit until nearly dawn. Sometimes the shadows on the curtains shifted, slow and deliberate, like the movements of someone not just working, but lingering. The Undertaker had no assistants left. By then, all who had worked under him had quit, claiming the hours were unbearable, the air too heavy, the tasks too strange. He told neighbors he alone was fit for the sacred work, that only his hands could prepare the dead with dignity. But the deputies began to suspect it was not devotion that drove him. It was secrecy. Night after night, they watched. He always chose the freshest arrivals, the bodies that had come in that same day. And he always worked alone. No prayers, no rituals. Just that faint glow burning against the darkness, the shadows moving unnaturally behind the curtains. Finally, curiosity curdled into dread. One damp autumn night, the deputies crept closer. They pressed themselves against the cold brick of the alley wall, just beneath the open window of the embalming room. The city had gone still. No carriages rattled down the cobblestones, no footsteps echoed. In that silence, the men listened. At first, only the scrape of metal on wood, the occasional clink of glass. Ordinary sounds of preparation, but then, something else, a low murmur. A man's voice, too soft to catch the words. The deputies leaned closer. It was not the voice of prayer. No scripture, no chant. This was different. A lullaby, perhaps. A humming tune with no melody they recognized. And threaded beneath it, something worse. Breathing, slow, heavy, rhythmic. One deputy swallowed hard. The other shook his head as if to clear it. The noises continued. The rustle of fabric, a sharp tearing sound followed by a muffled laugh. Not the laugh of a man telling a joke, but the small, private laugh of one indulging a secret hunger. The deputies pulled back, their faces pale. Suspicion was one thing, but proof was another. And if what they feared was true, they could not simply accuse. They had to catch him. The following night, one deputy made a plan. He slipped a coin to a stable boy who often delivered flowers to the parlor, telling him to leave the back door unlatched. The boy agreed, wide-eyed, pocketing the money without asking why. And so when midnight came, the deputies moved. They crossed the street in silence, boots scuffing softly against the stones, hands brushing the butts of their pistols for reassurance. The door opened with a whisper. The smell hit them first, not the sharp sting of embalming fluid, though that was there too. This was heavier, metallic, sweet, a smell that clung to the back of the throat and made the stomach turn. One deputy gagged, pressing a hand to his mouth. The other motioned for silence. They crept down the corridor, the lamplight ahead flickering faintly against the walls. Each step seemed louder than the last, the boards beneath their boots groaning in protest. The closer they drew, the thicker the air became, until breathing felt like pulling cloth through the lungs, and then they reached the door. The embalming room. The lantern inside burned low, casting long shadows that wavered across the ceiling. One deputy raised his hand, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. He pushed the door open. What they saw froze them where they stood. On the table lay a young woman, no older than 20. Her burial dress was torn halfway down, one sleeve dangling loose, her hair unpinned and scattered across the wooden slab. Her body had been arranged in a way that was not preparation. No undertaker dressed a corpse like that. And above her stood the Undertaker. His jacket lay draped over a chair. His collar was undone. His face was flushed, slick with sweat, his hands trembling not with grief, but with something darker. He turned slowly, caught in the lamplight like a rat startled in a trap. For a moment no one spoke. The room was so quiet the deputies could hear the slow drip of fluid from the embalming tubes onto the floorboards. Then the Undertaker smiled. It was not a nervous smile nor one of shame. It was thin, calm, almost amused. He tilted his head as if to say, "Ah, you caught me." One deputy stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. The other drew his pistol, voice cracking as he shouted for the Undertaker to step away. The man chuckled, a low, steady sound, so casual it made the deputy's skin crawl. "You don't understand," he said softly. "I was only preparing her." But the scene spoke louder than words. The corpse's dress torn, the bruises dark against her pale skin, the unnatural positioning. No embalming, no preparation, no act of dignity could explain what lay before them. The deputies advanced, their pistols steady now. The Undertaker raised his hands slowly. mockingly, still smiling as though this were nothing more than a misunderstanding. He did not resist when they seized him. He did not fight as they dragged him out into the cold night. He only kept smiling, that thin, eerie smile that clung to their minds long after he was locked in the jailhouse cell. And though the sheriff knew, they now had evidence enough to charge him. A heavier truth gnawed at him. This was not the first time. It could not have been. The confidence, the routine, the casual way the Undertaker had met their eyes. This was no accident, no sudden madness. This was practice, a ritual repeated in secret, perfected under the veil of respectability, hidden behind the sacred trust of his profession. And in the days that followed, as the sheriff's men combed through the Undertaker's records, their worst fears hardened into fact. Ledger books revealed bodies that had gone missing for hours before being returned to their coffins. Notes scribbled in margins with strange symbols and dates. Personal effects unaccounted for. Ribbons, rings, locks of hair. The Undertaker's crime was not a single act of desecration. It was a pattern, a routine carried out for years in silence. And the horrifying question that remained was not what he had done, but how many he had done it to. The arrest should have ended the matter. For a few days it almost seemed like it had. The Undertaker sat in his cell, calm as ever, while the deputies who had dragged him from the embalming room tried to convince themselves they had seen the worst of it. A single depraved man, caught in the act, confined behind iron bars where his sickness could harm no one else. The case, they thought, would be remembered as grotesque but simple. They were wrong. When investigators entered the funeral home to catalog its contents, they carried with them the assumption that they would find nothing more than embalming tools, ledgers, and perhaps the faint stains of his trade. What they found instead ensured the horror would not fade. It would deepen. The first discovery was a locked cabinet tucked behind the embalming table. The key was found in the Undertaker's waistcoat pocket, as if he had wanted it close even at the moment of his arrest. When the deputies forced it open, the hinges groaned, and the air that escaped was stale, as though it had not been disturbed for years. Inside lay scraps of fabric. At first glance, they seemed like rags, nothing more than remnants of burial gowns used and discarded. But closer inspection told another story, lace torn jaggedly, silk discolored not from age but from violence, fragments of cloth still smelling faintly of perfume, though the bodies they once adorned had long since turned to dust. Some pieces were brittle and yellowed, suggesting they had been taken decades earlier. Preserved, kept, trophies. Alongside the cloth lay ribbons, rosary beads, small lockets, the kinds of keepsakes families buried with their dead. Tokens meant never to leave the grave. Yet here they were, stacked carefully in boxes, catalogued not with names but with dates. It became clear these were not mementos misplaced. They had been stolen, and for what reason? No one dared say aloud. The horror did not end there. At the request of grieving families, several coffins were exhumed. What the cemetery workers uncovered only confirmed what the deputies had feared. Dresses were disturbed, stockings torn, hair cut short or pulled loose. Some bodies bore bruises and abrasions that could not be explained by illness or accident. A few had been buried for only weeks, yet their condition was unmistakable. They had been handled after death. The news spread like fire through the city. What had begun as whispers now thundered across every tenement, every church pew, every factory floor. Families who had trusted the Undertaker with their loved ones began to wonder, what if? What if their grief had been twisted into opportunity? What if the dignity they had paid for had been nothing but a mask for desecration? And then came the testimonies. Former apprentices, long silent, stepped forward. One recalled hearing laughter deep in the night, muffled by the thick walls. Another admitted he had once opened the door unexpectedly and been shoved back so violently he fled and never returned. A third spoke of nights when his master forbade him to enter at all, locking the door and emerging hours later with trembling hands and a pale face. At the time, they told themselves their employer was only weary, weighed down by the endless press of death. But now, in the shadow of his arrest, each admitted what they had always suspected. Something had been wrong. Terribly, undeniably wrong. The trial became a spectacle. Newspapers feasted on every grotesque detail. Headlines screamed of the ghoul Undertaker and desecrator of the dead. Sketch artists filled their front pages with exaggerated drawings of coffins split open, of shadowy figures leaning over the dead. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, shouting for justice, some demanding execution, and at the center of it all sat the Undertaker himself. He did not rant or plead. He did not even bow his head. He sat with hands folded neatly on the table, eyes steady, posture calm. If anything, he looked less like a man on trial and more like a man watching a play, as though they were the spectacle, not him. When the charges were read, the courtroom buzzed with outrage, desecration, theft, abuse of the dead. But his only reply, spoken in a voice so soft the clerk had to repeat it aloud for the record, chilled everyone who heard it. He said, "The dead are quieter. They do not lie. They do not judge." Gasps rippled through the room. Some wept, some shouted, but the Undertaker only sat back, his expression unbroken. Those words spread through the city like a sickness. Mothers pulled newspapers from their children's hands. Priests thundered from their pulpits about sin, desecration, and the sanctity of the grave. Families refused to even walk past the funeral home. It was shuttered, its doors chained, its windows blackened. Yet still there were stories. Passers-by swore they saw a faint lantern flicker inside, as though someone moved within. Others claimed to hear the faint hum of a tune, low and steady, when the streets fell silent at night. The true count of his victims was never known. Records were missing. Families, too ashamed to come forward, kept their silence, unwilling to have their dead dragged into scandal. Some historians argued that he had only touched a handful of bodies. Others, looking at the decades he operated unchecked, suggested the number could have been dozens, perhaps even more. Each missing ribbon, each unexplained bruise, each trembling apprentice's memory added weight to the scale. But one truth was undeniable. The Undertaker had not simply broken the law. He had broken trust itself. He had taken the one place families believed to be sacred, the place where dignity was guaranteed, where sorrow was supposed to be soothed by ritual, and twisted it into a theater for his hunger. And even in chains, he seemed to relish it. When reporters asked if he regretted his crimes, he said nothing. He only smiled, that thin, eerie smile that had haunted the deputies from the moment they first opened his embalming room door. A smile that suggested he had not been defeated, only interrupted. A smile that made the city wonder late at night how many more secrets lay buried in the ground. When the trial finally ended, the Undertaker was sentenced and removed from the public eye. The court declared justice served, and the community tried to move on, eager to bury both the crimes and the shame that had followed them. But like the coffins he desecrated, the case refused to stay closed. For decades, whispers lingered in New York. Families who had lost loved ones in that parlor rarely spoke of it aloud, but behind closed doors the rumors never died. Children were warned not to walk near the abandoned funeral home, its windows boarded, its doors chained. They said if you pressed your ear against the wood, you could hear the sound of humming, the same low tone apprentices once claimed haunted the halls. Some insisted they had seen him, long after his death, standing in the overgrown yard with a lantern in hand, his face a pale blur in the dark, watching, waiting. Historians looking back point out that this case marked one of the earliest public exposures of necrophilia in the United States. Before then, it was a crime so unthinkable that most people could scarcely imagine it, let alone name it. The press, hungry for readership, sensationalized every detail. But beneath the headlines, the cultural impact ran deeper. Laws began to shift, quietly at first, then decisively. Regulations around mortuaries and funeral homes tightened. Licensing, inspections, and oversight grew harsher. The case had revealed a truth too dangerous to ignore. Those entrusted with the dead could not be left unwatched. Modern criminologists still return to his story when charting the history of deviant behavior. They note how his calm demeanor, his meticulous work, and his reputation as a man of trust gave him the perfect cover. Some even draw lines forward, connecting this case to later scandals. Morticians caught selling body parts, embalmers discovered hoarding remains, graveyard caretakers exposed for desecration. His name, though often scrubbed from textbooks, remains a reference point in law enforcement training. A cautionary tale of what festers when authority meets silence. But the legacy is not only institutional, it is personal. Survivors' families carried their scars in silence. Some never permitted embalming again, choosing to keep their dead at home, dressed and laid out by their own hands, rather than handed to strangers. Others demanded sealed coffins, refusing the traditional final viewing, as if a lid could protect against intrusion. In time, the rituals of mourning themselves, once meant to comfort, became sources of dread. Death was no longer only loss, it was risk. Even today, true crime researchers and dark historians revisit his story, combing through brittle records and half-buried testimonies. They debate the number of victims, the psychology behind his confessions, and whether he truly acted alone. Some suspect others in his employ knew far more than they admitted, their silence shielding him and allowing his crimes to fester for years. And perhaps the darkest legacy is not the crimes themselves, but the erosion of trust they left behind. For centuries, undertakers and funeral directors were seen as guardians of dignity, caretakers of memory. Families believed that once a loved one was placed in their care, sanctity was assured. But he fractured that belief. He proved that even in death, perhaps especially in death, people are vulnerable. Time has passed. The parlor has long since been demolished, the street repaved, the city grown around the scar. Yet his shadow remains. Whenever scandals erupt in the modern industry, lost bodies, mishandled remains, thefts from the dead, his name surfaces again, whispered with the same unease it carried more than a century ago. Because what he destroyed was not only flesh, not only ritual. He destroyed certainty, and in a way, that is what unsettles us most. Evil does not always come from the shadows we expect. It does not always creep through alleys or stalk its prey in the dead of night. Sometimes it stands in the open. Sometimes it wears respectability like a cloak. Sometimes it works in silence, not behind barred doors, but in the very rooms where families place their trust. That is the lesson carved into this story. A lesson that should unsettle us far more than any crime committed in secret. Because the Undertaker was not an outlaw, not a drifter, not a man shunned by society. He was embraced by it, respected, paid, trusted with the most sacred of duties to prepare the dead for their final journey. Think about that for a moment. In life, we fear betrayal from strangers. We lock our doors. We cross the street at night. We teach our children not to trust unknown voices. But death strips away those protections. When we die, we do not choose who handles us. We cannot lock a door. We cannot cross the street. We are powerless. And it is in that powerlessness that this man found his freedom. That is what makes his crimes different from others of his time. A thief takes money, a murderer takes life, but this man, he took trust in himself. He shattered the bond between the living and the dead, the bond between families and the rituals that give them peace. And here is where the horror deepens. Because the truth is this: he could only do what he did because no one wanted to believe it was possible. His neighbors dismissed suspicions. Families explained away the bruises, the torn clothes, the strange marks. Assistants walked away rather than speak up. Priests heard whispers but chose silence over confrontation. The entire city looked away, and in that silence, he thrived. That is the part we must sit with. Not just his sickness, not just his appetite for desecration, but the silence that protected him. How many times in history has silence allowed monsters to continue? How many crimes persisted not because no one knew, but because no one wanted to know? This case forces us to face a truth most of us resist. Evil often survives not because it is strong, but because it is tolerated, hidden under the banner of trust, shielded by the belief that it can't happen here. Now ask yourself, how many times have you heard someone say, "That man could never do such a thing"? Or, "She's respected. There's no way it's true"? How often do we dismiss discomfort because facing it would mean admitting the world is more dangerous, more twisted than we want to believe? That is why this story still matters, more than a century later, because it exposes not only the depravity of one man, but the fragility of human trust. And it wasn't just the people of 1915 who paid the price. Families carried the scars for generations. Some never allowed another undertaker to touch their loved ones. Others abandoned the rituals of embalming altogether, keeping their dead at home where they could watch over them. Think about what that means, that one man's violation was powerful enough to alter traditions of mourning, to change the way an entire community faced death. Even institutions changed. Laws tightened. Oversight increased. The funeral industry was forced to place new safeguards where once there had been blind trust. And yet, even with those protections, stories continue to surface. Not in 1915, not in some distant city, but in modern times, in our time. Because the truth is, this story is not an isolated horror buried in the past. It is a reminder of a recurring pattern. Power left unchecked, trust left unquestioned, silence left unbroken. The Undertaker is gone, but the danger he represents remains, and that should terrify us more than his crimes themselves. When you step back, you realize his legacy is not just what he did, but what he revealed. He showed us how fragile our systems are, how easily they can be exploited, how quickly a mask of respectability can hide something unspeakable. That's the question that lingers, isn't it? How many others have stood behind similar masks? How many more stories remain hidden because no one was willing to pry open the coffin? And here is the final cruelty of his tale. It asks us to question ourselves. Would you have noticed the signs? Would you have spoken up if you were the assistant, or the priest, or the grieving mother? Or would you too have looked away, convincing yourself that grief was clouding your judgment? Most of us like to think we would be brave, that we would speak, that we would stop it. But history suggests otherwise. History shows us that silence is the easiest path, and silence is what monsters count on. That is why this story cannot be dismissed as just history. It is a mirror, and when we look into it, we see not only the Undertaker's face but our own. Our willingness to trust, our instinct to ignore, our fear of what it means when guardians become predators. The parlor itself is gone now, torn down, erased from the map of New York. No plaque marks the spot. No memorial honors the victims. But absence does not mean peace. The memory lingers in whispers, in half-told stories, in families that never spoke their suspicions aloud. And in that way, the parlor is still standing. Not in brick and mortar, but in unease, and maybe that's the final horror. That the true weight of this story is not in the past at all. It's here with us tonight, because when you strip it down, what it leaves you with is a question. If this could happen once, in a city filled with churches, with policemen, with watchful eyes, if it could thrive in the open for years, then how many times has it happened elsewhere? How many times has it been buried with the dead, unrecorded, unspoken, concealed behind polite smiles and locked doors? And what if it still does? That is the thought that follows you when the story ends. That is the echo that does not fade when the recording stops. Because in the end, this case is not about 1915, it is about trust. And it asks you directly one final question. When you close your eyes tonight, when you picture the people you trust with what matters most, how sure are you that they deserve it? You've just walked with me through one of history's most unsettling chapters, a story where trust was broken in the most unthinkable way. Now I want to hear from you. What chills you most about this case? The silence of the victims? The brazen confidence of the Undertaker? Or the thought that this might not be an isolated story at all? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this investigation unsettled you, and you want more stories that peel back the veil on humanity's darkest corners, subscribe to Truth Uncaged. It helps the channel grow, and it ensures you never miss the next case we uncover. And remember, history has shadows. Those shadows are never empty. Sometimes they hold the secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Until now, this is Truth Uncaged. Thank you for watching. And don't forget that the past is never truly buried.